We're on DAF Chaf Beis Amid Aleph, the 6th line. Tani Devei Rabbi Chia. Now, the topic that we're discussing are what's called shenios, which are forbidden relationships, erva relationships that are not forbidden by the Torah, but Chazal added these prohibitions because of their similarity by extension to the ones that the Torah does prohibit. So, Rabbi Chia teaches that shlishi shebivno v'shebibito v'shebeben ishto v'shebebas ishto is shnia. Those things are prohibited because of shnios. So what are they? Going down 3 generations. So not only your son, your daughter rather, and your granddaughter, but your 3rd generation down, which would be your granddaughter. Okay, that would be prohibited. And also the same thing, going down 3 generations for your wife. Thank you so much. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you. Okay, so therefore, it's not only that even though the Torah prohibits your wife's granddaughter, the Torah does not prohibit your wife's great-granddaughter, and Chazal therefore came along and said, no, your wife's great-granddaughter is what, that's what's called the 3rd generation going down. And similarly, Revi'i shebechame v'shebechamoso shnia. Going up, we also have the same restriction. The Torah prohibits 3 generations in the same family line. So it prohibits a grandmother and a granddaughter. But it doesn't prohibit a great-grandmother and a great-granddaughter. So therefore, technically, from the standpoint of the Torah, your wife's great-grandmother is permitted to you. And so that's one of the shnios. That's one of the things that the rabbis prohibited. So even though the Torah prohibits your wife's mother and your wife's grandmother, but the Rabbi Chia says, in addition to that, it prohibits your wife's great-grandmother. And that's what's called Revi'i, which is going up 1 additional generation up. So Amarle Ravina Ravashi. So as we're going to see, the following question is a question of language, not a question of halacha. We accept Rabbi Chia's halacha that even though the Torah only goes down 3 generations, only goes up 3 generations, Chazal continue it by adding on a 4th generation. But ma'ishna lamala de kachashiv la liishto, u'ma'ishna lamata de lo kachashiv la liishto. The question is, why is it when going downwards, you count 3 generations down because you're not counting generation 0, or like the present generation? In other words, you say it starts, generation 1 is your daughter, generation 2 is your granddaughter, which is prohibited by the Torah, and the rabbis came in and prohibited generation 3, which is your great-granddaughter. Why, by contrast, when you're going up in generations, we're also saying we're saying generation 1 is not your mother-in-law, generation 1 is your wife. So it's the same level as you. It's your generation that counts as generation 1. Then we go to generation 2, which is your mother-in-law. Generation 3 is your mother-in-law's mother, and generation 4 is your mother-in-law's grandmother, or your wife's great-grandmother. It's really a question of language. It's not a question of halacha. You go 3 generations up above your wife, you go 3 generations down below yourself and your wife. But why did Rabbi Chia choose to say 4 up and 3 down instead of saying 3 up and 3 down? That's what he really should have said. Okay? So the Gemara's answer is, L'mayla di isur mikoch ishto ka'asi chashiv la, Lamata disur lav mikoch ishto ka'asi lo kachashiv la. So the Gemara's answer is, again, from a stylistic answer, because the prohibition of your wife's great-grandmother starts because of your wife, therefore she counts as generation 1. But when we talk about your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, the prohibition does not start because of your wife. It starting with your daughter or your son. So therefore, we start with generation 1 being the generation below yourself. And that's why when we talk about going downwards, we talk about 3 generations. When we're talking about going up, it's going 4 generations, when in reality, they're both at the same distance. So the Gemara says, "Vaha ben ishto ubas ishto de isur mikoch ishto kasi velo chashivla." But wait a minute. You said two things when you're talking about going downwards in the generations. You talked about your own great-granddaughter, but you also talked about your wife's great-granddaughter. When you talked about your wife's great-granddaughter, the prohibition is also because of your wife. So you should have counted her as generation 1, Rabbi Chia, and therefore you should have said for a great-granddaughter from your wife, it should be 4 generations down, not 3. So the Gemara answers, "Aidi the Tana Shalosha Doros Lamata Didei Velo Chashava, Tana Nami Gimel Doros Lamata Dida Velo Chashava." So the Gemara answers again for stylistic reasons. Since we're talking about generations going down and we start talking about your own great-grandchildren, and there we don't count your present generation because the erva starts with the generation below you. Therefore, for your wife also, even though the erva starts with your wife, it's true that we could have counted her as generation 1, but for consistency's sake, when we're talking about generations below yourself, we don't count you or your wife as the present generation, we only count downwards from below. So it starts with her daughter, and then her granddaughter, and then her great-granddaughter. Okay. Amalei Ravashi l'Rav Kahana, Shnios devei Rabbi Chia, Yesh lahen hefsek o ein lahem hefsek. The question that he asks is, I understand that Rabbi Chia prohibits a great-grandmother of your wife, and he also prohibits a great-granddaughter of either yourself or your wife. My question to you is, what about the next generation above or the next generation below? Is it only great-grandchildren and great-grandparents, or is it great-great and great-great-great ad infinitum? So Tashma da Amarav Dalid Nashim Yesh Lahem Hefsek V'Sulo. Well, take a look at the brisa that we learned yesterday. Yesterday there was a brisa asking Mahim Shenios. What are all of the Shenios? And then it went through a whole comprehensive list. It talked about Aim Imo, the Aim Aviv, that so your grandmother, and going up in various generations, going down various generations. So when Rav commented on that brisa, he said, Arba nashim yesh lahem hefsek, that only 4 of the women that we're discussing that are shenios stop generationally at that person and don't go further up and don't go further down. And the 4 women that he listed did not include grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So the assumption is, and it did not include parents or great-grandparents of your wife. So the assumption is that they continue ad infinitum, both going up and going down. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily a raya, because Dilma kikama Rav le'ahi masnisa. Maybe Rav was only addressing the women listed in that brisa, and Rabbi Chia's list is not the same list as the one in the brisa. So maybe when Rav was saying only 4 women of that brisa that we learned previously do not continue up or down ad infinitum, but he wasn't addressing Rabbi Chia's cases. Tosfos has a problem with this whole line of reasoning, because Tosfos says one of the cases that Rav says goes ad infinitum is from your daughter-in-law, your daughter-in-law's daughter, your daughter-in-law's granddaughter, your daughter-in-law's great-granddaughter ad infinitum. Why would I think that Rabbi Chia's discussion of your great-granddaughter would not go ad infinitum when your daughter-in-law's descendants go ad infinitum? That doesn't seem to make any sense. If we've already established, according to Rav, that your daughter-in-law's descendants go ad infinitum, then surely your own granddaughters should go ad infinitum. So Tosfos says, no, you wouldn't necessarily think that, because there's more of a familial connection from an inheritance point of view to your daughter-in-law's descendants, because the Yerusha passes through your son. And therefore there's more of a connection physically because of the financial relationship that you'll have with those descendants than you might have with your daughter's daughter's daughter, or daughter's 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 daughter.
Are we talking about for you theoretically, or are we talking about for your descendants? Because, I mean, in terms of generations, 25 years. So if you go too far down, unless you're living to 200 years old.
Okay, but I mean, we're speaking theoretically, but we're also speaking practically. How far did the rabbis prohibit? It is, listen, all you have to do is turn on some reality TV to discover that these things could happen.
I know, but once you go four generations, already 100 years. 25 years a generation there. So.
That's in a normal circumstance. Look, I just read on the internet that the girl had a baby boy at the age of 12. Or no, she was 11. Her boyfriend was 12.
That's okay.
So, yeah.
So we're talking about for him, though, not for the descendants.
For bar mitzvah.
Himself.
For bar mitzvah.
For bar and bat.
For the guy himself, we're talking about. We're not saying about his son or.
I don't understand what you're asking.
In other words, we're talking about going so many generations up or down. It's for that one individual we're talking about, correct? For that.
Yeah, but it's also the other partner. It's talking about both of them, but that it's prohibited. Okay, Tashma. Shlishi or Revi in Tefillah. So the Gemara says, but look at the language of Rabbi Chia to answer your question. Your question is to go ad infinitum or not. He says it's only the third generation going down, the fourth generation going up. It sounds like that's it. And if you get above the fourth generation going up and below the third generation going down, there's no more even a rabbinic prohibition. So the Gemara says no. Dilma mishalishi va'elach miravi va'elach. No, maybe all Rabbi Chia was commenting on is where the rabbinic prohibition starts. It starts from the third generation going down it starts with a great granddaughter, but it doesn't stop with a great granddaughter. Maybe it goes ad infinitum. So you have no raya from there. So the Gemara leaves this as an unanswered question. Amarle Rava Rav Nachman Chazi Mar Haimi Rabbanan Da'asami Ma'arava Va'amar Ba'o B'Ma'arava Gazu Shnios Begerim Olo Gazu Shnios Begerim. So Rabbi says to Rav Nachman, he says, take a gander at a certain rabbi who came from Eretz Yisrael and said that the question was raised in Eretz Yisrael. And the question that was asked in Eretz Yisrael was the whole takana of Shnios instituted or placed upon Gerim or not. Now, why is Gerim a unique case? Now, a Ger technically is allowed to marry his sister. If a guy converts to Judaism and his sister independently converts to Judaism, so the halacha is Ger shenisgayer kekatan shenola dami. A person who converts to Judaism is like a newborn child, and therefore they're not related to anyone. Biologically they're related, but halachically they're not related. So technically it's permitted for a brother and sister to marry if they both convert to Judaism because they're not considered related. But the rabbis forbade it, and they said it doesn't look right because the perception is here when he was a goy he was prohibited to his sister, and now he goes to a higher level of kedusha by becoming a Jew, and he's allowed to do things that he wasn't allowed to do when he was a goy. So therefore the rabbi said that anyone who's related to him biologically when he was a goy, he's not allowed to marry even after he converts. The question therefore becomes, do we place upon them not only the erva prohibitions but also the shnios prohibitions as well? So we know that a ger cannot marry his daughter or granddaughter. Can he marry his great granddaughter? Okay, so the Gemara says, Amar lei hashta uma erva gufa ilav shelo yomru boin mikedusha chamru lekedusha kala lo gazru behu rabbanon shnios mibaya. So the Gemara says it stands to reason that we're not so machmir. In other words, the whole reason why we don't allow a person to marry his daughter or granddaughter is because of the appearance. That how can you say that when he was a goy he was prohibited, and now that he's going to a higher kedusha, he's now permitted to something that he wasn't allowed to before. So therefore, it stands to reason that the rabbis would not go so far as to prohibit the shnios to this person. Amar of Nachman, Gerim hold ve'asuliyad neimabuhu milsa. So Rav Nachman says, now that we're talking about Gerim, let me point out something else that's interesting about this whole issue. Achen min ha'em lo ya'idu ve'im he'idu edusin edus, and achen min ha'av me'idin lechatchila. If you have two brothers who convert to Judaism, they're half-brothers, they're maternal half-brothers. Lechatchila, they should not testify for each other in a Jewish court, even though halachically they're not related. But because of appearances, they shouldn't testify. But b'di'eved, if they did testify, their testimony is admissible. And when it comes to paternal half-brothers, they share the same father and they were Megayer. So then even l'chatchila, we allow one brother to testify about the other brother for all different halachic issues, because they're completely not related. Al pi halacha. Now, the question is, what's the difference between a mother and a father? Why are we more machmer by maternal half-brothers than paternal half-brothers? So Rashi observes, because two brothers that came from the same woman's womb, it's a worse appearance if you allow one to testify for the other. Because everyone knows that they came from the same woman's body. But if they're paternal brothers, then there's no testimony that they're brothers. In other words, yes, they grew up with the same father, but no one actually saw them emerge from the same body. So therefore, from the appearance standpoint, it's not as bad. And that's why we're only machmir lechatchila for maternal half-brothers, but we're not machmir at all for paternal half-brothers that were Megayer. Ameimer amar afilu achen min ha'em nami me'idin lechatchila. So Ameimer disagrees, and he says even maternal half-brothers, lechatchila, we let them testify for each other. Umayshna me'arayos. So now the Gemara's question is, well, why is it any different by the laws of Erva? In other words, you're telling me that a brother and sister may not marry, even though halachically they're not related because of the appearance. Why then don't we place a ban on testimony completely by let's say two brothers or a father and a son who are Megayer? The Gemara answers, Erva l'chol masura edus lebeistin masura v'gershin iskayer kekatan shenolad dami. So the Gemara gives a very basic answer, a very simple, very straightforward answer. The laws of Arayos is not something that's deliberated upon in Beis Din. Two people get married. They don't have to go to Beis Din first before they get married. If we were to allow a brother and sister who are Megayer to get married, then people would mistakenly think that brothers and sisters can get married, because this is not something that's under the jurisdiction of a Beis Din. But when it comes to testimony, that's only something that's done in Beis Din. And therefore, Beis Din knows the difference between Gerim and non-Gerim, and people who are naturally born as brothers, right, as Jewish-born brothers. And therefore, just because Beis Din will admit the testimony of one brother for another brother who are Megayer, they'll know enough to know that you can't extrapolate from there to a regular case of brothers. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Mi sheyesh lo ach mikol makom, zokek es eishes achiv liyibum, v'achiv hu l'chol davar. Now, if a person has a brother, no matter where that brother comes from, meaning that no matter what that brother's halachic status is, if that brother is alive, if, let's say, Reuven has a brother Shimon, regardless of what Shimon's halachic status is, if Reuven dies, then Reuven's widow falls to Yibum for Shimon. And Shimon is Reuven's brother in all respects. The Gemara will clarify what these terms mean. Unless Shimon was born from a non-Jewish woman. Because if Shimon was born from a non-Jewish woman, even though they're completely brothers, they're only biological brothers, they're not halachic brothers, because Shimon is a goy. Now, and similarly, if a person has a son, and that son is from a previous marriage, and he gets married to another woman, or another relationship, and he gets married to a woman and then he dies without children from that woman, as long as he leaves over a son, doesn't matter whether it's from this marriage or any other marriage, that wife does not fall to Yibum, because the only time that a woman falls to Yibum is if her deceased husband had no children at all. So it doesn't matter what the halachic status of that son is, as long as he's alive, he exempts his father's widow from Yibum, and v'chayv al makaso ve'al kilulaso. And furthermore, regardless of that son's halachic status, that son has the obligation to respect his father and to not strike him and to not curse him, and if he does, he's subject to the death penalty.
But if that woman wasn't Jewish, in other words...
Well, 1 second, you're going to see in just a second. Uveno l'chol davar, and he is completely his son in all respects, chutz mimi sheyesh lo ben min hashivcha or min ha'ovedes kochavim, unless the son was born from a non-Jewish woman. So that's just like we have that exception by a brother, we also have that exception by a son. So the Gemara now says, Mikol makom la'asuye mai. When you told me that if you have a brother, regardless of his halachic status, what were you coming to refer to? So Amar Rav Yehuda la'asuye mamzer. It's coming to include that even if your brother is a mamzer, so in other words, let's say we're paternal brothers, but my father had an affair, had an adulterous affair, and he had a child with a woman who was married. So that child is a mamzer. Then he got married legitimately, and I was born. So Reuven is a mamzer. Reuven is or the other way around. So Reuven is a kosher child. Shimon is a mamzer. Even though Shimon's a mamzer, Shimon still is a legitimate yavam, and therefore Reuven's wife falls to yibum. Now we learned before that a mamzer can only do chalitza, can't do yibum. But the point is that Reuven's widow is not off the hook. There's zika between Reuven's widow and Shimon. So the Gemara says, Pshita, achivu. But the Gemara says, why would I think otherwise? Why would I think that there's no zika just because Shimon is a mamzer? The Gemara answers, Mahu de tema, leilev ach va'ach b'nei Yaakov, ma'alahalin kishem v'lo psulin, afkan kishem v'lo psulin, kamash malan. I might have thought that we learned before that the word achim in the pasuk is connected to the sons of Yaakov. And therefore, just like Yaakov's sons were legitimate sons of Yaakov, and legitimate brothers, so too, the only time that the mitzvah of Yibum applies is if the brother is a legitimate child. And therefore, Kamash Malan, that's why you need the Mishnah to tell me that even though he's illegitimate, even though he's a mamzer, there's still a zika to him. So, frak the Gemara, ve'ema hachinami. So the Gemara says, maybe taka, that's the halacha. Maybe there is no zika bichlal if the brother is a mamzer. The Gemara says, no, you wouldn't think that because Kevin dil inyan Yibum miftar niftar mizkak nami zakik. As we'll see in just a minute, when a man has an illegitimate son who's a mamzer, that son exempts the father's widow from yibum. So since we see that an illegitimate son can create an exemption from yibum, then by the same token, an illegitimate brother also creates or generates zika for yibum. And how do we know that an illegitimate son exempts yibum? We'll see that from a pasuk in just a moment. But anyway, the fact is that they're connected. Mamzerus, bastardy, does not remove a son from the category of being a son vis-a-vis yibum, and therefore bastardy does not remove a brother from being a brother vis-a-vis the laws of yibum.
You would think that a son who's a mamzer really couldn't build his late father's house.
But no, his house is already built. I think what you mean to say. You would think that the house is not really a house if his only child is a mamzer.
He can't do anything more after that.
Well,
Yeah.
there are rectifications even for a mamzer to have eventually his progeny become part of the Jewish people, like Rabbi subtly just said. A mamzer, according to certain poskim, a mamzer can marry a ger, and therefore the children will be now legitimate. Okay. Va'achiv hu l'chol davar, and we said also that he's your brother in all respects. So the Gemara says, L'may hilchasa, what does that halachically mean? Liyarsho u'letamelo. So there are two halachas in the sense that he's completely your brother. Even though Shimon is a mamzer, Reuven has his obligations to him. That number one, if Reuven dies, Shimon is his legitimate heir. And number two is that if Shimon dies, Reuven, if he's a Kohen, has to be metame in order to take care of his burial, and he doesn't. He's one of the 7 relatives for whom a Kohen makes himself tameh. So the Gemara says pshita achivu, but that's also obvious. It's your brother. So the Gemara says no, because salkadai techamina holu chesiv ki'im l'she'ero hakarove love, and the Torah says that a Kohen may not be metame for anyone except for his she'er, who is his relative. Now the word she'er refers not only to a blood relative, but it also refers to your spouse. So va'amar mar she'ero zu ishto. The word she'er refers to your wife. V'chesiv lo yitama ba'al be'amav lehechalo. And we also have another pasuk that says by a Kohen that a husband cannot be metame amongst his nation to profane him. And we interpret that pasuk to mean that yesh baal shemetame v'yesh baal she'ein metame. One pasuk says that a husband is metame for a wife even though he's a Kohen, and this pasuk seems to imply that a baal, which means a husband, is not metame for a wife. How do you reconcile it? Hakeitzad metamehu liishto kishera ve'ein metame liishto pisula. That there are 2 types of wives that a Kohen could have. A Kohen could have a wife that he's allowed to be married to halachically, but he could also be married to a woman that he's not allowed to be married to, such as a grusha. And what the Torah is telling you is that even though halachically she's your wife, a grusha, there's tfisas kiddushin, there's actually a marriage there. But if a Kohen's wife who's a grusha dies, he's not allowed to be matami for her. And so the Gemara says, I might have thought that just like a Kohen cannot be matami to an illegitimate wife, hachanami matami hu la'ach kasher v'matami la'ach pasol. So too, he may not be matami for an illegitimate brother. So kamash malan, and therefore you need the Mishnah to tell me that no, even though you're a Kohen and your brother's a mamzer, you can still be matami for him. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, ve'ema hachanami, but maybe taka the halacha should be that just like you're not matami for an illegitimate wife, you're not matami for an illegitimate brother. The Gemara says, no, hasam la'afuke kayama hacha achivu. No, the difference is that the reason why the Torah says don't be matami for an illegitimate wife is because you're obligated to divorce her. But there's no obligation for you to distance yourself from a brother who's a mamzer. So therefore, there's no reason to connect that to a wife. That's what the Mishnah is pointing out. By an illegitimate wife, you're being over and isser every time she's your wife. So therefore, the Torah says that's why you can't be matami for her. But your brother didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything wrong by being his brother. And therefore, when Shimon dies, just because he's a mamzer, that doesn't change the status. And that's what the Mishnah is pointing out. You should still be matami for him. This, by the way, this whole, in this Reform theology is, he tries to use the case of the mamzer to demonstrate how, we've become so much more moral since biblical times because, look how the Torah stigmatizes the mamzer. He didn't do anything wrong, and yet he's excluded from the camp of Israel. How insensitive. Okay. But of course, there are times when people cause damage to other individuals. The analogy that I like to give is that, if a woman was smoking crack when she was pregnant, and the child that is born is permanently handicapped, so where's the justice? How can you say, it's a biological phenomenon? There are certain laws in biology, and there are certain laws that mimic biology in the Torah as well. If you commit a heinous crime, and it can affect your children too. Okay. Except, now, your brother is your brother, except when he's not your brother, which is when he's born from a non-Jew. So my time, what's the reason? How do we know this, rather? Because the Torah says regarding slavery, it says that if a man is a Hebrew slave, it can be given a shivcha, a non-Jewish woman slave, to bear children. And the Torah says that those children do not belong to the father, they belong to the master of the female slave. So you see that anytime you're dealing with a non-Jewish woman, whether it's through a non-Jewish slave or just a regular non-Jewish woman, the children are not the father's anymore. And therefore, he's not your brother, he's a non-Jew. Mi sheyesh lo ben mikol makom poter. Then the next part of the Mishnah was that if a man has a son, regardless of his halachic status, he exempts the father's widow from falling to yibum. Mikol makom lasuye mai, Amar Rav Yehuda lasuye mamzer. So again, it's coming to include the case of a son who's a mamzer, just like the case of the brother. My time ado Amar Kra uvein ein lo ayin alav. And what's the reason? So how do we know that even an illegitimate son exempts the father's widow from yibum? The answer is because the Torah says ubein ein lo, that when a man does not have a son, that's when there's yibum. Any time that the man has a son, there's yibum. Now Rashi gives us a very bizarre interpretation of how we see this from the pasuk. He says the word ein could have been written without the letter yud. Because as long as you have a tzera under the aleph, it sounds pretty much the same. Ubein ein lo. The extra letter yud tells me that ayin alav. Read it as an ayin, and therefore examine the man to see the decedent, to see if he has any descendants whatsoever. And if he has any descendants whatsoever, even if they're mamzerim, then they no longer subject the widow to yibum. So it's a very unusual way of interpreting the pasuk. The Aruch has a different way of interpreting it, but nonetheless, the Gemara says, we have a tradition that this pasuk teaches me that no matter what the status of the son halachically is, he exempts the widow from yibum. V'chayev al makaso, and therefore such a son, even though he's a mamzer, is liable for striking or cursing the father. Amai. So the Gemara says, I don't understand why he should be liable. Karikan v'nasi v'amcha lo sa'ar ba'osa ma'isa amcha. We know that there's a prohibition in the Torah of cursing a nasi, a president of a tribe. But the Gemara had said that based on the pasuk, he has to be ba'amcha, he has to be among your nation, which means he's behaving like a Jew. But if he's not behaving like a Jew because he's sinful, then the prohibition of cursing him is no longer extant. Now, if a man had an adulterous affair and he had a child who's a mamzer as a result, then obviously he's not oisa masa amcha, he's not behaving like a fellow countryman, he's not behaving like a Jew. So why am I, the mamzer son of that man, prohibited from cursing him? He's not a righteous man, so there should be no longer a prohibition of cursing him. Why can't a mamzer curse his father for having committed adultery and making me a mamzer, right? What's wrong? I mean, that's the Gemara's question. Kida Amar Rav Pinchas Mishmei Rav Papa ba'asa tshuva hachanami kisha asa tshuva. So the answer is because we're talking about a man who did tshuva. Yes, he had a fling, he had an illegitimate son, but now he's a bal tshuva. He sits all the way in the the rabbis. And
but if he didn't do tshuva, then he wouldn't.
Taka, if he didn't do tshuva, then there's no issur of cursing him because he's not ba'osa masa amcha. But the Gemara's answer is that yes, you know what? He had a mamzer, but he did tshuva. He became a bal tshuva, and now you're not allowed to curse him.
Is a mamzer only Ishasish or other?
Any erva where there's an issur kares or worse, that creates a mamzer. Brother and sister create a mamzer. Right.
But when you start with a guy, when you start judging anybody about something that they didn't do right, where does it end? If it's not Shomer Shabbat, or I mean, where do you start with this pasuk?
They can answer. You can do tshuva for everything.
Well,
you can.
That's a fair.
Of anything.
That's a fair question, and the Rishonim discuss what is the definition of a Russia, depending upon the context of society, how society views certain mitzvahs and so forth. So it's a valid question, but I think we can all agree that if a man commits adultery, has a child with a married woman, society acknowledges that that's sinful, and therefore the Gemara's logic is fair in all contexts.
Depends on society.
Well, I hope we're not that. Well, anyway, all right. V'hai bar tshuvahu. So the Gemara says, since when can a man who has a mamzer do tshuva? V'hatnan Shimon ben Menasya Omer ezehu me'uvas lo yuchal liskon. Shlomo HaMelech in Koheles said that there are certain corruptions that can never be repaired. What's an example? Zeh ha'boal ha'erva v'holid mimeno mamzer. That's a man who commits adultery and has a mamzer as a result. You can never fix that because the mamzer is standing there right in front of you as a constant reminder of the sin. So how can you tell me that the guy corrected the sin by doing tshuva? The Gemara answers, Hashtamiya osa maisa amchahu. Yes, you're right that there's permanent damage through a sin, but as long as he's behaving like a fellow countryman, then he's still subsumed under the rules of being a regular Jew to whom the laws apply. And therefore, if the Torah prohibits you from cursing him, even though the damage that he caused is irreparable, but lamaisa, you're not allowed to curse him. So therefore, you have the Gemara acknowledging that tshuva doesn't fix everything. Tshuva does not fix an act of adultery which produced the mamzer. It doesn't fix it. Just like, just because a person murders, if a person commits murder and he does tshuva, you didn't bring the person back to life. So tshuva doesn't always repair everything, but it does make a person now to become a fellow countryman. You have to treat him with the same protocols of any person who's part of Jewish society. And therefore, if the Torah says don't curse your father, no matter what error your father may have committed in the past, if he's osa maisa amcha, if he's behaving like a Jew today, you have to treat him as a father. Tona Rabbanan. The Brisa now says, Haboal achoso v'hi bas eshes aviv chayiv mishum achoso u'mishum bas eshes aviv. So we're going to see now a machlokas in a Brisa. The Tanakama, the Chachamim say that if a man has intimacy with his sister, and not only is it your sister, but it's your sister within the context of marriage, which means that you have a regular nuclear family. In other words, mom and dad got married. They had me and they had my sister, and then I have a relationship with my sister. So according to the Chachamim, I have two isurim. I've committed two violations. One is achoso, and one is I've uncovered the erva of my father's wife's daughter, because those two are mentioned separately. The Torah talks about the prohibition of your sister, and it also talks about exposing the erva of your father's wife or her daughter. So therefore, this girl is my sister, and it also happens to be my father's wife's daughter, who happens to be my mom also, my mom's daughter, yes. But I've committed two isurim, and the ramification would be is that if I did it b'shogeg, then I'd have to bring two karbanos, chatas, according to the Chachamim, instead of just one karban chatas. So, but Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eino chayev ela mishum achoso bilvad, v'lo mipnei bas eshes aviv. And Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, no, you only are committing one avera of achoso, of your sister, and you don't have any additional prohibitions. So my time mayu derabanan. So now let's first analyze the Chachamim. So Amri Mechti Ksiv Ervas Achos Chabas Avicho Vasimecha. So we have two psukim in the Torah. One talks about the erva of your sister, and there the pasuk seems to be talking about regardless of whether she's your sister from in a marriage or whether she's your sister that was born out of wedlock, right? Like like I said, in reality TV, kids are born out of wedlock all the time, but she could be my full-fledged sister. Whether it's my sister from my mother or my sister from my father, doesn't matter, says the Torah. You're not allowed to uncover her erva. But then we have a second pasuk. It says, Ervas baseshus avicha moledes avicha choschai. The Torah has another pasuk that says that the erva of the daughter of your father's wife you may not uncover. And she's your sister. So the fact that you have two separate psukim means that there's two separate isurim. So lama lishma min olachai v'mishum achos u'mishum baseshus aviv. So therefore it must be to obligate you twice. Because if the Torah already prohibits my sister, then why does it have to tell me a second time my sister in the context of marriage? The answer is that I'm chayiv twice. So the Gemara now says, B'Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda, what will his response to that? Why does he say there's only one Isser? Amar kra achos chahi, mishum achoso atamachayivo v'yatamachayivo mishum baseshus aviv. He says, yes, but in the context of my sister in a married situation, the Torah says, achos chayi, she's your achos, meaning that it's coming to exclude any additional isurim. She's only usher to you because of achoscha, she's not usher to you because of any other issue. And that's how Rabbi Yossi holds that you're only chayiv one time. The Rabbanan hay achoscha hi my avdilei. So now what do the Chachamim do with the word achoscha hi? What do they do with those words? Miboilu lechayvo al achoso bas aviv uvas imo lomar she'ein masirin min adin. So they take the words achoscha hi, which are written in the context of a sister in marriage, and they apply it to a sister who's my sister not in marriage, not from a marriage situation. When my sister and I were born out of wedlock. And they say that the previous pasuk, which talked about a sister born out of wedlock, if you notice, it only talks about a half-sister. It says that my half-sister from my mother or my half-sister from my father is an erva to me. How do I know that a full-blown sister, a full sister, is prohibited to me? So you need those words, achos chahi, written in the next pasuk, to teach me that even though she's my sister not from a marriage, but she's my sister, and she's a full-blown sister, she's also prohibited to me. Because the pasuk that talks about a sister out of the context of marriage is only talking about a half-sister. And what would you argue? You don't need that pasuk because it's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? If my half-sister is prohibited to me, then surely my full sister is prohibited to me. But comes along Rabbi Yossi and he says, no, ein masirin min adin. You cannot create a punishable offense from a kal v'chomer. A punishable offense can only be created from an explicit statement in the Torah. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yossi's klal. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, I'm sorry, that's what the Chachamim say. He was the klal. Sorry, they're going in the Chachamim now. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, and how does Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda know that your full-blown sister from a non-marriage is prohibited to you, since it's not explicit? And he uses the words achoscha hi to teach me something else. Im kein lichtov rachmana achoscha hi lamali mishum achoscha tamachayva v'tamachayva mishum baseishus avid. He says, I learned both from those two words, achoscha hi. From the word achoscha, I learn that my full sister from a non-marriage is usher to me. And from the word he, in that pasuk, I learned that when my sister is also from a marriage, so therefore she's the daughter of my father's wife, she's only usher to me because of achoscha and not because of anything else. So he basically he says, you have two words there. One is achoscha and one is he. So he is the delimiting clause, and achoscha teaches you that that even my full-blown sister is usher to me. V'rabonon, afal gav dichsiv achoscha itzrich lemichtav hi, shelo tomar ba'alma masirin min hadin. And the Chachamim say no, the extra word he is needed for another reason. And the point is this, is that if I would have only had the word achoscha without the word he, I might have thought that in other places in the Torah, you are able to arrive at a punishable offense through a kal v'chomer. And therefore the Torah needs to tell me that just like over here, you have to explicitly write the punishable offense in order for a person to know that it's usher to him, which is the full-blown sister. So too, everywhere else in the Torah, you cannot derive a punishable offense through a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says, "V'chi teima choscha dekasav rachmana lamali milsa da'asi b'kal v'chomer tarch b'kasav lakra." So kasav rachmana hi. You might have argued, well, if the Torah already creates an example over here of where ein masir min adin, where you cannot create a punishable offense unless it's explicit, so therefore that's true in all other places in the Torah as well. Why do you have to write he? The answer is because just because the Torah says the word achoscha doesn't mean that you learn from there automatically that ein masir min hadin, that you cannot create a punishable offense through a kal v'chomer. Sometimes the Torah, maybe I'll argue that the Torah could create punishable offenses with a kal v'chomer, and yet the Torah wrote achoscha anyway. Because sometimes we have this principle that the Torah will write things that I would have already known using a kal v'chomer. And therefore, you don't necessarily know that everywhere else in the Torah where you want to create a punishable offense, it has to be written explicitly. So therefore, the Torah writes the extra word he to tell me that just like over here, the Torah wrote it explicitly, so too everywhere else where you want to create a punishable offense in the Torah, it has to be written explicitly. Bottom line is that according to the Chachamim, the words achoscha hi are not coming to delimit a sister from a marriage to only one isser. They hold it's multiple isser of both your sister and your father's wife's daughter. V'Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda imkein lichtavei rachmana la'aschoscha hi be'idach kra. And Rabbi Yehuda's response to the Chachamim's argument is, if the Torah is trying to tell me a halacha about ein mashirin min hadin, that you cannot create a punishable offense through a kal v'chomer, then why are the words achoscha hi written in the wrong pasuk? They should have been written in the pasuk where the whole law of a sister out of marriage, where it only says half sister, and then it should have said an additional time achoscha hi over there to tell me that it's coming to include a full sister as well. The fact that the Torah chose to put those words achoscha hi in the other pasuk, which talks about a sister from marriage, is coming to teach me the additional halacha that even when it's your sister from marriage, you're only punishable once for the offense of your sister, not for the additional offense of your father's wife's daughter. V'Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda hay bas eshes avicha my ovidlei. So now the Gemara's question is, why then, according to Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda, is it necessary to specify that the daughter of your father's wife is usher in a case when she's your sister? After all, we already know that from the previous pasuk, and according to Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda, there's only one offense. Mi boile mi sheyesh lo ishus le avicha bra, prat lachosa mishivcha v'vedes kochavim shen ishus le avicha ba. The answer is that it's coming to add an additional facet of information. That the only time that your sister is usher to you is if your father could theoretically be married to that woman who was the mother of your sister. But if your father halachically cannot be married to her, such in which case, when she's a non-Jew, so then she's halachically not your sister. And therefore, if you have relations with a girl who's biologically your sister through your father, but who is not Jewish, you're not oiver on the erva, iser erva of achoscha. Ve'ema prat la'achoso me'anusa, but the Gemara says, but maybe I'll argue that when the Torah talks about the girl being your sister because she is the daughter of your father's wife, maybe the Torah is trying to tell you that you're only liable when the girl is your sister from a marriage. But when she's your sister from a non-marriage, maybe bichlal you're not oiver at all. And maybe the way you read the two psukim is that the second pasuk is qualifying the first pasuk. The first pasuk says anytime she's your sister, she's usher to you, and the second pasuk is telling you only when she's born to you in a marriage. So the Gemara's answer is Hahilo matzis amart midarava. You could never interpret it that way because of Rava's statement. The Rava Rame. Rava raised the contradiction. The Torah says you may not uncover the erva of your granddaughter, habas bina dida ubas bita dida share, which implies that your wife's granddaughter or your spouse's granddaughter is permitted. But then we have another pasuk that says that your spouse's granddaughter is prohibited. So how do you have these two psukim that seem to contradict each other? The first pasuk implies that only your biological granddaughter is usher, but not your wife's granddaughter. But then the other pasuk says that even if she's not biologically your granddaughter, but it's your wife's granddaughter, that she's usher. So Hakate said, how do you reconcile that? Kan ba'onsin, kan b'nisuin. That the distinction is drawn whether the woman that had the children is your wife or not. When she's your wife, then her grandchildren are usher to you. When she's not your wife, but it was just a woman that you had a relationship with, then her grandchildren are not usher to you. But what do you see minimally from there? So, like Rashi points out, Habas bena meish acher gila degale delavishtachahi, that you are allowed to have a relationship with children that a woman that you had a fling with has from another man. But umihu beno min ha'onsin benohu. But nevertheless, if you have a child from that woman, that child is your biological offspring, regardless of whether you're married to her or not, and therefore that person is an erva to you. So if you have a daughter or a granddaughter from a woman that you have a fling with, that's still your daughter or granddaughter. And similarly, anyone that you have any connection to, regardless of whether it's in the context of marriage or not, as long as you're biologically related to them, such as a sister who's born out of a marriage, but still she's your sister. That's what you see from this pasuk, that just because they're born out of the context of marriage doesn't stop them from being an erva to you. And that's how I know that everyone would agree that regardless of whether it's in a marriage or outside of a marriage, your sister is always your sister. We'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.